Okay, go live. Going live, and we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today, I am here with our guest, Zach. You may not see him yet. We're just doing some
They don't
on-stream
see
editing.
any of us.
Yeah, we'll be our face cams will be here shortly. Um, and so yeah, I am of course with my co-host Sebastian as well.
Hello.
And today we are going to talk about a very fun subject. We were just having some very interesting conversations before the stream. We were talking all about like different, like interesting sort of conundrums and problems. And so today we are talking about philosophy, of course, um, which it is so interesting. Just like a brief sort of look into it this week has been very interesting.
They can see me now.
I mean, nice. Like philosophy, it's about how we see ourselves, it's fun. It's great. So yeah, I'll just quickly do the plugs.
Okay, now they can kind of see
Visit
all of
the
us.
Gravity Max website at gravitymaxmedia.com. We got some cool stuff there. Stuff about my books. If you want to get like the links to buy my books, that's all there. If you want to read the summaries and the what do you call it? Like previews, there are previews of my books there if you're not quite sure. If you want to read them, and then other things about different YouTube channels and different. I wrote a few articles. So yeah, check out the website. Also, follow Gravity Max on social media: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Patreon. Links in the description. On these social media platforms will provide you with updates about the show if any updates occur or are necessary. So yeah, next, also follow Sebastian on social media, Instagram and YouTube at 128 seconds. He makes short educational videos that are 128 seconds long, and they're the great like brief counterparts to these lengthy live streams. So if you are a busy person, then those are the videos for you.
All right.
And then
On-stream
finally,
editing is done.
nice,
These are the images that
wonderful.
correspond. Oh, wait, nope, I lied. On-stream editing is not done. I gotta size ourselves to the
Uh,
boxes.
all right, all right. But yeah, finally, A Somewhat Odd Start is my most recent book, and it's on Amazon if you want to buy it. So yeah, go check that out. So that's all the plugs. Are you ready, Sebastian?
Hold up.
Hold up.
All right. Sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, no problem.
So, just to run
Um,
through that again now with visuals, visit the Gravity Max website at gravitymaxmedia.com. Also, follow me.
yep.
Somewhat Odd Start, fantastic book. Check it out. It's the third in the trilogy. Best trilogy known to man. We can't say it's a New York Times bestseller. That's what we learned last episode. But it's
Yeah,
getting
I
there.
think we'd get
It's
sued, right?
well on its way.
It's on its way, definitely. But yeah,
Knowledge.
for the love of knowledge, that is what loosely this is what philosophy means. Philo means love, and osophy, something like that. I forget
Yes.
exactly what it is.
Sophie.
Sophie, yeah, that means knowledge. So
Shout
philosophy
out to any
means
Sophies watching. You're wise. Let's go.
you're wise. Yeah, yeah. Philosophy means to love knowledge, and philosophers are lovers of knowledge. So that's what we're talking about today. It's a very fun subject. Uh, yeah, it's just interesting. I mean, it's just great.
Yeah. I'm going to turn my air
But
conditioner off
anyway,
because it's making some white noise. But I will go to
all
the
right,
first slide real quick.
all right. Yeah, branches of philosophy. So there are four different branches of philosophy that loosely relate to what exactly they are talking about, what sort of aspects of human life they are concerned with. Um, and yeah, let's just go into those, I guess.
Yeah, each theory sort of relies on each of the branches for certain explanations of things. They all work together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, the branches, obviously, they don't take a stance. It's more of a subject area. Whereas the schools of philosophy, which we'll get to later, are individual stances and perceptions of life or the universe or whatever. So, yeah. All right. So, first of all, we have metaphysics. So, Zach, do you want to give us a little intro? Or
So, metaphysics is essentially examining the origin of the universe and the origin of nature from the perception of ideas, and from the perspective that you're looking not at like the actual elementary universe, but rather what people think and how they perceive reality. So one of the pioneers of metaphysics was Immanuel Kant, who wrote about it. And if you're familiar with the term meta, sort of helps you understand metaphysics. It's beyond simply the realm of like physical or natural observations.
Yeah, I would say that.
so it's like it's a bit more spiritual, like a bit more about the why,
Yeah,
right?
that's why a lot of the shops that kind of fit in with Arcana, stuff like that, they're called metaphysical shops because they're supposed to be things outside the realm of the physical world. And yeah, like Zach said, in philosophy, it's used to look at how do we, perceive like the big things, like the universe as a whole. How is it perceived by the individual? And a whole lot of people have a whole lot of stances on that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I would say a lot of the ones that we're going to look at today fall under metaphysics. I would say this is, I might say that this is the biggest branch of philosophy, or the one that most philosophies at least fall under to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of examining why a rational agent makes certain choices or makes other choices falls into metaphysics, and that is definitely something that like a lot of the most popular philosophies are concerned with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely, because a lot of the schools of philosophy suggest a way to act, and the reasoning behind that has to be some sort of view of reality, of the world, of like what is the purpose, what is behind everything, and that is like metaphysics. So it's important as like the justification for why you should act in the way that they suggest you act.
But yeah, so definitely a lot of things are going to fall under this. There's going to be some really clear ones that fall under this that we'll talk about a bit later. But I thoroughly enjoy metaphysics because, to me, it gets at the real root of the issue. It's like, everything. Well, I guess that is it's a philosophy in and of itself about everything just being our perception of what it is. And that actually kind of fits nicely into the next one, because that also bleeds over into the idea of, is there an absolute truth or not? Which is talked about by epistemology, which is the next one.
So epistemology... Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to talk about the cave allegory.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So, right here, these two funky dudes are depicting what is Plato's, I think it was Plato's allegory of the cave. He basically asked the question of, if there were people in a cave and the only way they experienced reality or objects were just shadows on the cave wall, they would perceive that to be reality. Despite them living in a three-dimensional world, everything they perceive is only two-dimensional. So if we as humans are living, or if we're only perceiving things at a third-dimensional level, could we be possibly living in a fourth-dimensional plane of existence, I guess.
Yeah. And it is really interesting. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
So the allegory of the cave suggests that it's impossible for an observer to see the entire picture at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult for us to make decisions about the universe and make metaphysical claims without understanding the concept of truth. But Plato eventually explains in the allegory that the people that were in the cave get taken out to see the rest of the world, and in some conditions they believe what they see, while in others they do not. So it is possible for humans, via the allegory of the cave, to understand truth and to comprehend truth, but it's not as easily done as some might think.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because it sort of plays into simulism, which is the simulation hypothesis, or into solipsism, which is sort of the idea that only what I see is true personally for every single person, that you can only know that what you see is true. You can't know that what other people say they see is true, because they could all be lying to you. I mean, that's basically the conspiracy theory brain. But it is interesting, the whole epistemology. It because it really, if you try and deconstruct what do you actually know to be true, you'll find that it's a lot less than you would be comfortable with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
From your own experience, if you're viewing this through solipsism, what you actually experience is very much removed from everything we know about reality.
Yeah, and this is definitely the most mind-bending one out of the four, I would say, because the more you think about it, like you said, you can start kind of delving into a little bit of getting into more existential stuff. You're like, how do I know anything's true? What's going on?
How do we know George Washington was a real person?
Exactly.
I've even been to his grave, but how do I know that's him?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, it gets even more. How do you know?
I don't know.
How do you know Ronald Reagan was a real person? Or how do you know that Russia exists?
Or
right?
for our
have you ever
audience,
been there?
how do they know that we're real and not just computer programs? Because the only way that they experience us, unless they, live near us or seek us out, don't do that, but is in a two-dimensional way.
Yeah, exactly.
There is
we
zero
are
evidence that we
shadows on the cave.
Yeah, there's no evidence that we live in a three-dimensional world, because all of this, and this is obviously skepticism, is what we're talking about here, is being skeptical of things and taking things down to their smallest part and being like, oh, but how do you know? Oh, but how do you know?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here, and that's why it's the most
it
mind-bending one.
It is really crazy, because if you get into simulation theories, then it could literally be that things behind you no longer exist, and they only exist again when you look at them, right? And that's due to, say, efficiency saving measures in a computer program, that might be done, rendering. Say that you're in Minecraft, right? And if you go too fast in one direction, you'll see the chunks don't appear, right? And it's just invisible. What if that is our reality, except the simulation creators know perfectly how to make sure that everything that's in view exists properly, and everything that is out of view doesn't need to waste simulation space? It's very, very strange and interesting. It makes you want to look behind you and say, is it real? And it's it's very crazy epistemology. It can take you to pretty crazy places.
It's very interesting that principles like that, philosophical principles like that, can be found in the highest levels of mathematics as well. It's always really weird to see philosophy and mathematics kind of cross over. I think the number one place where they do that is in quantum mechanics, specifically, bleeding over into general relativity a little bit, but with quantum mechanics, when you're trying to for example, determine the location or approximate location of an electron, you can only determine the most likely places that that electron is. This led a lot of quantum theorists to theorize that, and they often use the allegory of if a tree falls in the forest, doesn't make, and there's like no one to hear it, doesn't make a sound, that thing. With quantum mechanics, the answer is like no, because if there's like nothing there to like perceive it or observe it, per stuff like the observer effect, kind of in that general sphere of thinking, if there's no one there to observe it, or if there's nothing there to change it, it just doesn't happen. You know, it raises a lot of really weird questions.
Definitely.
And with a lot of theoretical physics, where they're assuming things to be true based on observations, you have to wonder how warranted the truth that they're claiming is. That's obviously why science is always subject to change, and why it's like constantly evolving. So I do think this branch is specifically really intertwined with science, because a lot of natural science is really just determining what is truth and what is matter.
We have some chat from Daikaiju Productions.
Oh, yeah. All right. Daikaiju Productions says, Cave Allegory Summary. But do you know where he is? Edna Mode.
I need to rewatch The Incredibles.
I don't know the reference.
That was, that's when Mrs. Incredible thought that Mr. Incredible was off, like, cheating, that he wasn't on some secret assignment. She says that. I gotta rewatch that. It's a good movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of want to watch the second one, but I don't know. I don't know if it's any good.
The second one was... Have you seen it?
I'm a bit wary of second ones in general. You know what I mean?
So you haven't seen it?
I haven't seen it.
It wasn't as bad as some of the sequels we've seen.
Okay.
It definitely... It wasn't worth the wait. Like, they're like, what, 20 years apart?
20 years or whatever.
Some insane number.
Yeah.
So...
Even if you watch it, it's bad, you can sleep soundly knowing that Boss Baby 2 will be undeniably worse.
No. Yeah. Exactly. Anyway, next one. Axiology. So, this is your type of like philosophy that's like, what is right and wrong?
Yeah, I feel like this
should you do?
This is what
trolley problem.
Yeah, this is what most people think of when they think philosophy, is stuff that falls under the purview of axiology, because it's ethical philosophy, and it's also aesthetic philosophy, and the difference between those are like ethics, like what is right to do and what is wrong to do and how should we treat other people, stuff like that. Whereas aesthetics are more perception of things like beauty or things that are enjoyable or pleasurable. It's like, how do we as a society determine what is pleasurable or what is beautiful? So a lot of people in recent years are like, oh, this is my aesthetic. This is what they're talking about. They're like, this is uniquely beautiful to me. And I just threw a picture up of, I think it's the Golden Gate Bridge with just a lot of fog around it.
Nice.
Definitely like it. Definitely part of my aesthetic.
Yeah. Nice.
That's an interesting connection to make, because, as you said, everyone's aesthetics are extremely varied. But it seems like today our ethics are more unified. Everyone more or less agrees on some inherent truths. Like, you'll be hard pressed to find someone that will argue that murder is good in a situation where it's not necessary. So I think, as far as ethics is concerned, we have made a lot more, by virtue of having a majoritarian society. It seems like everyone has a very similar ethical code, but like the more you examine it, the more you realize that your ethical code might be different from everyone else.
Interesting. Can you think of a time in history where it was like a very, very stark ethical contrast?
I mean, Russian Revolution, we could see some pretty. I mean, obviously, economic theories colliding with each other,
Hmm.
you can tie to any revolution. But even if you go to the American Revolution, you can see
Yeah.
some sort of political and as well as natural rights, like philosophical arguments being
Hmm.
not they were not unified, so we had to have a revolution. I think within most societies though, we see a lot more unified ethics.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Um, and then I guess something that sort of applies is a little thing called like the narcissism of small differences, which is that even as ethics becomes more unified, it just sort of magnifies the smaller differences,
Mm-hmm.
if
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean. Um, it's basically like how if you live in New York, like New York City, then the boroughs really matter. But if you don't, then it's just like, oh, New York
Yeah,
City,
and actually,
right? That's basically what it is.
the same thing can also happen with aesthetics, which is why, for
Mm,
example, like people like to have big reactions when you say things that really don't matter. For instance, like if you're like, I don't like cookies and cream ice cream, some people are like, oh, how dare you, like they'll go off on you, but it's because like ice cream is a thing that most people like, that our aesthetics have shifted towards being in favor of ice cream, so it accentuates
mm,
the minutia of it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
interesting.
and but obviously, I feel like those kinds of things, like uh, aesthetical, aesthetic differences, have less of an impact than like ethical stuff,
Mm,
because entire countries
definitely.
are governed by ethical codes, and they have been.
Mhm.
I don't think countries are really
Well, because
governed by aesthetical values, but you know,
yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean that's fair because in a disagreement over aesthetics, worst thing that happens is someone decorates their house poorly. In a disagreement over ethics, right? Someone's like murdering someone else, you know?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, definitely I can see that. I can
Although
understand that.
there are instances where like both of them impact each other. Like for example, freedom of
Mm,
expression
mm-hmm.
relies a lot on, it's an ethical question, which to me is very obvious that people should have freedom of expression and the freedom to make independent decisions about how they present themselves, etc. But that's really something that you could argue is aesthetically motivated because
mm,
maybe some people in a community won't want people to express themselves in a
Mm-hmm.
certain way. And
Yeah,
there are connections between like inherently human desires and ethics. So I think there is a bridge between aesthetics and ethics.
yeah. Same with the
yeah.
laws on like graffiti and stuff like that. Like
Mm,
a large portion of the population like actually enjoys like graffiti being on buildings. I do. I like seeing it. I think it's really cool art, and I think it can make like a building much more aesthetically pleasing. But there are laws criminalizing it. So again, there are some bridges between the two.
yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. Because it does get into ethics again, because it's like, um, I may like the style, I may find it aesthetically pleasing, but then I would say that you should ask permission first, you know, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, because like if it's not your building. But yeah, so it is interesting.
Yeah. And then we go into the fourth branch, which is logic, and
Yeah,
that's just the principle of
the
logic.
thinker.
It's how do we, yeah, this is the
Uh,
thinker. It's how do we rationalize our thinking? How do we organize our thinking? And, what logical conclusions can we make based off of other things? So, a lot of what people know, or, what most people probably know from this branch is the paradoxes, logical paradoxes that arise from talking about the subject. And we're going to talk about a bunch of famous ones a little later. Um,
Mhm.
Or we could actually get. Do you
Yeah.
want to get into Theseus right now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
let's
right.
just talk about it. So the ship of Theseus, we were talking about this a little before stream. Uh, it's basically the problem is that there is a ship called the Ship of Theseus, and slowly over time, as parts wear down, one by one, they are replaced. So, say every couple weeks, a single part of the ship is replaced. The question is, after enough time has passed, eventually every single part of the ship has been replaced. Is it still the same ship after all that time, or is it an entirely different ship? Um, and yeah, it's an interesting question because it makes us ask ourselves what properties make it the ship of Theseus? Is it that the materials that go into creating it make it the ship of Theseus? Or is it that something about how it functions and how we treat it, is there an emergent property of the ship of Theseus? Is that what it is? Um, so it's an interesting sort of question based on how you answer it, and it has a wider philosophical ramification in that what the ship of Theseus does is largely what human bodies do. Just every 7 years, all of the atoms in your body have been replaced. Uh, Many cells will be replaced. Cells die, and the new cells come to replace them. But what that means is that every 7 years, you are not composed of the same materials. And so if you answer the Ship of Theseus question saying that, no, it's a new ship, then you would also have to say that you yourself are a new person every 7 years. So it's very interesting like that. Um,
So should we all explain our stances and then get
Yeah.
into it?
yeah. All right. I can start, I
Mm-hmm.
guess. I would say that it's still the same ship. Um, I don't know how I should elaborate on that. I guess it's just that in science, there's like a sort of new idea of emergent properties, and that's like basically the parts of a whole. Well, it's basically the idea that something is more than the sum of its parts. The properties of water are more than simply the properties of individual water molecules. The properties of an ant colony are more than the properties of individual ants. The property of human bodies are more than the properties of individual cells, and so on. And so I would say that it's the same ship if it, I guess, like functions the same and exists as the same thing. I mean, that's difficult to define. It's still
Mm-hmm.
kind of vague, but it's like if it still matches the blueprint of the ship, then it's the same ship. Um, but that is difficult because then it's like, well, what if two ships are built? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, I could think about it a lot more and probably develop that answer more. But yeah.
I take the stance that it is a different ship, um, partially because it's an inanimate object that doesn't have one real central part. Like the human body has a central part. That's the brain. You know, it's responsible for us being sentient, for us being able to have free will, stuff like that. Or if we do even have free will, which we'll get into later. But all of that stuff, the functionality of a boat and like I guess the ship of Theseus is like a more like a sailboat because like
Mhm.
just for the allegory to work a little better because in like modern boats they have like an engine which some people point to as being the brain of a thing, but going by the sailboat, the power of that sailboat is not consolidated in any really one part of it. Like you could make an argument like, oh well, it can't go anywhere without the sail. Okay, but you can't really steer anywhere without the wheel, and you can't stop without the anchor. Like there's like different parts of it, and then there's also a piece about our assumptions of that thing. I make the argument that as soon as you change that boat, even on a very small scale, it like a deliberate change on a very small scale, It is a new boat. It's a new model of that boat. It can still be using like the same general blueprint of it. Like before we were talking about we were using the example of just replacing a screw. We're just replacing that one screw. Our assumption of that boat is not that it's going to suddenly start working in a completely different manner. It's still going to work in the same exact manner, considering that the screws were like identical and made in the same set and were just replaced. Obviously, the boat is not going to do some funky thing out on the water because you replace a single screw, because that's not how it works, because the power isn't consolidated in that screw. But that's just our assumption of it. So our assumption of it is that it's going to continue in the same manner, and that's an accurate assumption to make. But it is a new model of the same thing. And that's basically my argument.
I would say that you can neither claim that the ship is new or that the ship is the same, because objects, in my opinion, do not have an identity or an existence independent of time. And that being said, the ship, of course, is going to be a different ship as the variable of time changes, as everything in the universe naturally is. You cannot have the same object if time has elapsed, since you're comparing it because of force or position or a bunch of other things that change every second. So if you're considering if the ship is the same as if you had two ships, one the original and one an exact copy, they would have to be existing at the exact same time in the exact same location in order to truly be an identical ship. So I think the paradox, although it raises a good problem of what exists at a given moment, fails to account for the fourth dimension of time.
So then that is interesting, because you bring it back to people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so does that mean at every single instant in time we're a different person?
I would say so. And I would also suppose that every single instant in time, maybe not on the frame by frame scale, but on the minute by minute scale, the human is constantly evolving. Every single experience we have, whether it's extremely small or what, could influence you in some way, however minute it might be. And that all of those small little changes, like replacing a screw in the ship of Theseus, lead you to be a new person. But it's also not fair to necessarily compare someone after a minute has passed to the person a minute before them and ask if they are the same. Because that would be like if you compared the ship and then the same ship, except you stretched it in the X dimension out, and ask if that was the same. It's not going to be the same if one of the variables have changed.
I feel like there are some universal constants that we can kind of rule out based on the fact that they just affect everything at the same time. So, with time, it's either everything is constantly just different every single second, every single whatever, or you just rule it out entirely and say, because this affects all things at all times, even though we're talking about time itself, so that's a little weird, but because this thing affects everything, we just don't factor it into the equation, because that would be a little, redundant, I guess, especially if it's affecting everything. So
yeah,
I feel like that's another piece to it.
Depends on your frame of reference when you're attempting to answer the question. I think that's why a lot of the logical paradoxes are so interesting, because if you are able to think about it from a certain frame of reference, you can see any of the sides and agree with them.
I think it also
it is interesting.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask, what is the property of age then? because if it's a new ship every single time, if it's a new version of ourselves after every moment, then the property of age doesn't really exist. I believe that you can have a, say, 20-year-old ship of Theseus, but every component of that ship of Theseus is less than 10 years old. I think that's possible.
I don't know. What I was going to say earlier was that I find this logical problem pretty interesting because it also spills over into epistemology, because it also raises a question, kind of what I was talking about earlier with our assumptions of it, of the whole idealism versus realism debate, and we'll get into that later, of we assume that the boat is going to function in the exact same way because all we changed was like a screw, or like we replaced a floorboard or something like that we would perceive as insignificant. So obviously the sailboat is going to keep on sailing in the same exact fashion. Nothing is going to change. Is that based on our perception of it, because it is operating in the exact same manner, is it the same thing? And that raises the question of, is it just because we perceive it as functioning in the same way, is it the same thing? Or is there some outside truth that we're just not privy to, that they are not the same thing because the sum of their parts are different?
I would say, for me, I think both questions are separate, and you can say that in every instant, the ship of Theseus is not the same as it was as in prior instances, but at the same time, in every instance, it's still the ship of Theseus in that it performs its duty as a ship as long as it's not fundamentally changed in a way that would prevent it from living up to like what we expect of it or what we assume it will do. So it's different. It's not the same like from a matter or position standpoint, but it is the same in that it still will do what humans expect from it.
I see. Yeah, because you could say that just as the ship itself, as the thing itself changes, the title Ship of Theseus also changes with it. And the title will change. Say the title will change, but not as much as the ship is able to change. So, the ship can burn down or sink. And if that happens, then the title doesn't go with it. But the title will change to a certain extent with the ship. And that is interesting.
We're going into, and like, obviously with logical problems like these, we need to go into like just technicality after technicality. Like, like if we were like really like faced with this and like we had to get on this ship and they were like, oh, we changed the screw, you still gonna trust this ship? This isn't the same ship that you rode into Greece on. We'd be like, get out of here. We're gonna use it's the same thing, because that's our perception of it. So there's a lot of technicalities to it, but that's interesting about the title, Ship of Theseus going with it, because that's its function relative to us, and it's up to us to determine if that is the weighing mechanism that we're going to determine if it is the same entity or not. If it performs the same action to us as it was created to do. It was created as the Ship of Theseus. Theseus was like, hey, make me a boat, and that's what they did. And if Theseus is still able to ride that boat and it takes him everywhere that he needs to go, it's performing the same action that it was literally created to do. It's an inanimate object, so it doesn't really have too much of an identity of itself other than being the Ship of Theseus. So does that identity follow it as it's performing the same action to the same man that it was created for? And that again goes into our perception of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a
So
pretty
yeah,
interesting
very good
logic.
logical problem. I would love like some of these classic logical problems. I think you could go on for hours, literally,
Absolutely.
just hours discussing them. Uh, but yeah, so now let's go to the different schools of philosophy. And these are basic. So the schools of philosophy basically give you different interpretations of the world and how to answer these different problems. So the different schools of philosophy will have different principles, and they'll say, as a result of these principles, this is my answer to the Shiva Theseus problem, or the
Mm-hmm.
trolley problem, or any other philosophical problem you can think of.
And
So yeah, let's begin.
again, like usually we try not to be like too opinionated on things on this stream, but I
Mhm.
feel like this is an area where like that's very encouraged for us to be opinionated. So there are some philosophies on this list that I just could never subscribe to. The next one is a prime example of that. I could never subscribe to the next one, but
Yeah.
we should definitely feel free to voice our opinions on it.
I think it's a very personal thing to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
philosophy, and I honestly think even the greatest philosophers weren't necessarily trying to convince others to think the same way that they did on account of like what they actually said. It was more like they were trying to enlighten people or show them another way to think. And
Mm.
if they agreed with it fundamentally, then of course they would follow it. But philosophy has
Mhm.
never been about convincing people that one thing is better than another. And I think certain philosophies function better in certain like applications, obviously, but it's still there's still so much that we haven't really seen societies implement a lot of these schools of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so this is interesting. So the first philosophy on our list here is nihilism. Uh, so nihilism, and another thing I would say about a lot of these philosophies is that a lot of them have sort of colloquial definitions. So people will like call each other nihilist. Um, and generally, I would say the colloquial use is pretty close to the actual definition of it, and we have this chart here that sort of describes the main tenets of nihilism versus philosophies that can be described on a similar sort of set of answers, but with different answers, right? And so what the nihilists say is that there is no such thing as meaning or value. There is no inherent meaning in the universe. The pursuit of meaning does not have meaning in itself. The individual's construction of any type of meaning is not possible. There is no resolution to the individual's desire to seek meaning. That is nihilism. So it's pretty bleak. And that is the colloquial definition, is sort of a bleak nihilism of like nothing matters, like the world is terrible kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
and that was the most famous nihilist is Friedrich Nietzsche, who I forgot what book he wrote where he like talked about all that stuff, but he's the most well known. He's like supposed to be the father of nihilism. And yeah, it's
this is the guy who said things like God is dead and we have killed him.
Yeah.
Stare into the abyss and the abyss will stare back into you.
Pretty intense guy. Pretty intense guy. Had a very nice mustache. That's what I know about him. But I believe nihilism was not the first one on this list. I think existentialism came first out of these three. I might be wrong. We can look at the dates. But nihilism is, as you can see by the chart, it's just there's no meaning, there is no value. There is no, meaning in the universe. You shouldn't try to pursue meaning. Your construction of meaning is false. Like, it's just so, like you said, it's bleak, and it is just very contrarian to, I would say, how most people live their life. most people live their lives, because in an individual's life, what they try and do is construct meaning. Like you try and you create a daily schedule, or you try and follow an agenda. You're like, oh, I gotta water my plants. I gotta walk my dog. Stuff like that. What you're doing is you're creating meaning. You're saying, hey, my plants and my dog have meaning and value to me, so I should help them out by sustaining their lives. Whereas a nihilist would not.
And yeah, and it is interesting, because if you think of the effects of nihilism, it's probably damaging. If you were to have, say, a whole society, like a country of nihilists, would probably collapse very quickly, because there would be no meaning to.
Well, they would find no meaning in being a country. Meaning. Yeah, they would be like, this is dumb, exactly. And they would all just split immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think nihilism is more of an idealistic approach to philosophy, because it is clearly not based in reality, because, like, as you guys said, almost everyone lives their life in pursuit of meaning and value. And if you look at, like, every historical civilization, it's almost like, it's very seldom that you'll find civilizations where people exhibited any of the tenets of nihilism. I also think, though, that nihilism, by existing, it seems like it is suggesting that there is some meaning or value, or even inherent meaning in the universe, because it is asserting that the universe is meaningless, which itself seems to be, to me, like an attempt to pursue, like, a value, at least. So it's like, almost by valuing the existence of nothing, of no values, it almost contradicts itself in a way. And that's why I personally do not understand it, but I do understand some parts of it, because I think, you know, especially with monotheistic existentialism, there's almost a pressure for people to find meaning that makes them, like, live their lives in a way where what they end up doing isn't actually meaningful to them. So maybe there would be some benefits to it, to just accepting your fate and being content with living without an inherent meaning, like, in terms of your broader existence in the universe. Because, you know, again, we're just like, we're on some random planet, we're a completely random species. From the extremely large, like, picture, we are completely irrelevant. And I can agree with that, but I think that is sort of a moot point. It doesn't really advance civilization as we know it.
That's the number one issue with nihilism. It's, if you throw a blanket statement and say that absolutely nothing has meaning, you can just say, okay, so everything has equal meaning, and, you know, like, everyone has inherent meaning in something. You cannot have, like, because we have sentience, and just, you know, however many years of evolution, we evolutionarily, it's in our DNA to give meaning to things. And that,
I mean, at the very least, you can think of valuing your own life,
exactly,
for instance, or valuing your children. These are essentially just biological urges that exist due to natural selection. And so if it benefits the individual to have these values and this meaning, then they will have it over time.
And that's another thing, is that this goes into ethics. This goes into axiology as well, because obviously it's first and foremost, nihilism is metaphysics, and all of these things that we have up are, but nihilism most acutely, I guess, falls also into axiology, because if nothing has meaning, then your moral code is completely bunk. Like, you would not have a moral code if nothing has meaning and nothing has value, because immediately, you know, your own life doesn't have value, and the lives of others don't have value. And other people's emotions and your own emotions now also no longer have value. And that's, like, in the modern age, that's kind of what ethics are created or at least based on, your own moral code, your own ethical code is based on, your interactions with other people, or at the very least, how other things make you feel. So if you say that those two weighing mechanisms no longer matter, you cannot have a moral code. True nihilists cannot have a moral code, which is, again, why I would say that there are no true nihilists. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, if he was a true nihilist, he never would have written whatever book he wrote that popularized nihilism. He never would have cared to, share it out, because, it'd be highly unlikely that he would have even made it that far in life if he devalued his own life and the lives of others so much.
Yeah, and so then on another note, I would say that probably the majority of societies in history have fallen at the exact opposite end of this spectrum under monotheistic existentialism.
Mm-hmm.
But more recently, I would say societies and people are tending to fall more into either atheistic existentialism or absurdism. I feel like that has become more likely recently than it used to be in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But
and yeah, it's also interesting. I did a quick search. I wanted to see when existentialism, absurdism, and nihilism came out. Existentialism did come first. It was in the earlier half of the 19th century. The most famous existential philosopher, I'd say, is Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard. I think he was Danish, and he popularized it. He's regarded as one of the first existentialist philosophers. And then absurdism is kind of a derivative of existentialism. Kierkegaard is also called an absurdist based on his work with, I'm forgetting his first name, but Camus, who's a French philosopher. And nihilism came out in the latter half of the 19th century when Nietzsche was around.
Mm-hmm. And the underlying theory behind existentialism, especially monotheistic, had already been around for thousands of years.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The theory hadn't been named, but you can see that societies essentially agreed on most of those terms. So why do you think today, Max, we are sort of moving away from knowledge of God leading to one's understanding of the apparent meaning of the universe?
I would say primarily, because the share of atheists in the world, or agnostics, or fairly secular people is increasing. Because obviously, if you're not monotheistic, you can't really have monotheistic existentialism, right? But then underlying, I would say, if you think of a lot of the things that occurred in the 20th century, think of the lost generation after World War I. That was a big blow to the sort of ideas that people had about honor and God, because it was so horrible, the First World War, that it really degraded people's beliefs in an inherent purpose, because it's just brutal death and destruction. And then again, World War II, just before it, the Great Depression, and then all the just horrible things I feel that have happened throughout the 20th century have probably really, I guess, depressed the human spirit in a certain
and
way.
Also,
I feel like that could be the reason.
My answer would be scientific knowledge as well as that, because it is no fluke that most polytheistic cultures put the most powerful god as the god of thunder or the god of storms. It's because in their life that was think about it. If we didn't know what storms were, what caused them, if we had no idea about weather, all of that stuff, that'd be incredibly scary. The sky is screaming at us and we don't know why. That's why these cultures made the god of thunder the most powerful of the whole entire pantheon. And then going into like monotheistic things, they were just like, all right, we don't understand all of this stuff. Let's just attribute it all to one guy. And, you know, both are equally valid, but a lot of them stemmed from lack of scientific knowledge, which is why they decided to give meaning to things that they could not reason. There would be like, it'd be incredibly difficult for them to study the like cells of an animal, for example, or to understand why like lightning occurs without the proper instruments. Their societies just had not come that far. That'd be my answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with that advancement in scientific knowledge, they, like religions in general, didn't need to make claims about inherent meaning in the universe as much. I feel like recently religions are becoming more closely aligned with like civic codes and trying to get people to see things in a certain way and act in a certain way because they think it is actually what is the most moral thing to do. And they're becoming less about answering the question of, you know, is the universe inherently created by a divine to serve some purpose?
Yeah, and I mean, personally, I would probably fall in atheistic existentialism, which is basically there is meaning to different people. You can have meaning in your life, but there is not an inherent meaning in the universe. That is just the one caveat there. Yes to everything else, but there is not inherent meaning in the universe just because like there is no evidence that there is. But you can have plenty of meaning for yourself. And I definitely think scientific knowledge sort of contributes to that kind of worldview because it says that, well, because we observe the different things that occur as natural processes that were once attributed to a higher power and the will of some higher power. But now we know that it's not that, that it just is. And so that says, well, there isn't an inherent meaning in the universe, but we personally can have meaning.
Yeah, there you go. We also have some chat from Daikaiju Productions.
All right. Daikaiju Productions says, yes, Nietzsche. When everyone has meaning, nobody does. Syndrome and Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Syndrome was a nihilist. But yeah, it's really, again, I can never subscribe to nihilism. I believe it's something that you could never truly be a nihilist, or like at least like in a technical way. Like if I've never met anyone that calls themselves a nihilist, but if, you know, anyone out there does, there is no way they subscribe to like true 100% nihilism, or else they simply really would not be living, because they wouldn't have like a survival drive, because there'd be no meaning in survival. They could also play it off as if there's like no meaning in like in death, I guess, which is a key difference between absurdism and nihilism, because death does have meaning in absurdism. But I feel like it's almost like optimism and pessimism, because you can never be a 100% optimist. If you were a 100% optimist or a 100% pessimist, you would never do anything with your life. Because if you were 100% optimist, you would be thinking, oh, well, everything will turn out okay, even if I do absolutely nothing. And if you were 100% pessimist, you'd say, oh, well, everything's going to suck no matter how hard I try, and you do nothing. So it's not a philosophy that you can subscribe 100% to. It's something that you can like flirt with a little bit more. It's something that you can perhaps employ in a specific scenario. It's something that can help calm you down. Like if you have anxiety about like a test or something, you're like, you know what, nothing matters, so I'll just do this and I'll get out. Isolated situations like that, because in isolated situations you can be optimistic or pessimistic. You could say, hey, you know, I think this is going to turn out well for this test, or you could say, I don't think I'm going to do too well on this. That's where stuff like this should be implemented.
Well, and then something interesting is that I would bet that a lot of self-described nihilists are actually much more aligned with hedonism, because you would say to them, what's the purpose in living, right? Like, why breathe? Why eat if nothing matters? And then they would probably say, well, it would really be painful not to eat or not to breathe. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do it because it minimizes pain. But as we will talk about later, that is actually the philosophy of hedonism. So that would be my bet for a lot of nihilists, like that say I'm a nihilist, but then actually do things that, you know, they just do things.
Yeah, should we transition to that?
That would be more hedonism.
I mean, I know it's a little bit, it's like technically out of order. Well, I think it makes more sense.
Briefly,
right?
Yeah, okay, here, I'll swap the slides. Sure, let's talk about hedonism now.
Yeah, I want to talk about
Let's go. Hedonism. Here, I'll present again.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
As Max just explained, the optimization of pleasure and the avoidance of pain is one way to see hedonism. Hedonism can also be seen as just giving into your desires and doing things that might be seen as wrong from other, like, more objective points of view, just because they make you happy. Often, I think hedonism is criticized because people can be claimed to be ignorant of true happiness, and like if you're addicted to something that's like harmful to your body, like a drug or something else, you experience happiness, but it's not actually good for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I personally, I kind of like hedonism, but obviously not the more short-sighted hedonism of just sort of giving into any sort of base urge, because in the long run, that will actually increase pain. And it is sort of interesting because it really depends on how you apply hedonism to a situation, because you could apply hedonism to say, that cake looks like it would taste really good. But then on the other hand, you could say, well, in the long run, eating an entire cake will have much more negative effects on my body and will increase the amount of pain I experience over the long run due to medical problems and just day-to-day living with being like unhealthy. And so you could decide not to do it. And that could still be seen as a hedonistic decision because you are trying to minimize pain in the long run, even though at the same time, you know, eating the cake would be maximizing pleasure from a certain perspective. But it's really just about short-sightedness versus long-term thinking.
Yeah.
And hedonism doesn't necessarily suggest one or the other.
Mm-hmm. I think the compromise is actually kind of made through Ayn Rand, because I know through objectivism. Yeah. I'll let you share the quote, but objectivism kind of, in my opinion, balances the pursuit of pleasure and happiness with the caveat that people still have to be, you know, active. They can't just be, you know, lying around like in pleasure, doing nothing that will be good for them in the long run. They can work for their happiness, provided that they work for it. So it's obviously like a huge capitalist ideology, but
yeah. So again, I'll mention I've been reading Atlas Shrugged, so I sort of thought of a similarity between here. And one of the quotes about objectivism is that it is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. So that clause that says his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life is basically a statement of hedonism. That your purpose is to achieve happiness for yourself, which is effectively saying to maximize pleasure and avoid pain. but of course in a more complex way, because happiness is sort of hard to quite pinpoint. And that is an interesting thing about what is pleasure and what is pain, because someone can, say, be rich, right, and have every like luxury, but then still internally in their own mind be miserable. And so the question is that internal like emotional issue, is that a form of pain? And does that negate all of the physical pleasures that they experience? And so would figuring out a way to solve their emotional issues actually like supersede the physical pleasures? And that is just sort of interesting. That's why saying, I guess, seeking happiness rather than specifically seeking pleasure might be a better way to go about hedonism. Because if you're seeking happiness, that does not come from just giving into your base urges, right? That does not come from simply trying to maximize pleasure, because often doing those sort of activities can lead to internal anguish, which is just really fascinating. So,
Yeah, I think for happiness, we're looking for the local maximum of pleasure that coincides with long-term success, as opposed to the absolute maximum of pleasure where nothing is in moderation and it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
And hedonism has a negative connotation in today's day and age. Like it's kind of looked down it's kind of looked down upon because people's minds immediately go to the guy that just lazes around all day and just eats junk food and, you know, just does things, again, that, you know, that's kind of a fallacy, because that is the short-term happiness versus the long-term happiness. And also another thing that people tend to forget is that someone that aligns with hedonism can also be working to increase the happiness of others rather than just themselves, because that action, and I would say that action for most people, also increases your own happiness. Like when you help out other people, that usually, you know, makes you feel good. So a hedonist with that mentality would be incredibly resourceful to their community. And I feel like that's something that's really overlooked in today's day and age.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because I would say most people, to a certain extent, behave hedonistically. And I think it's actually biologically hardwired, because the purpose of pain in any creature is pain is supposed to alert you when you are doing something or something is happening that is causing damage to your body that could risk your life. Right? Like that is why we feel pain. It's basically a mechanism to say what you are doing is increasing the chances that you will die. And that's just natural selection. A being that has a stronger feeling of pain is more likely to avoid things that will cause it to die, and that will result in the genes proliferating. And then it's the same thing with pleasure. Pleasure tends to align with things that will make you more likely to survive. Now, the difference is that the development of technology has far surpassed the rate at which evolution can occur. And the result of that is that for humans uniquely, a lot of things that are pleasurable or painful don't quite align with what is going to make us survive, because our circumstances as a species have changed so much in the past, 10,000 years, that biology is simply unable to keep up, right? Like the reason that fatty foods and sugary foods taste so good is that they were so rare in the wild, and that if you came across them, it was the best thing to eat because it would give you the energy you needed. Like humans, they could just barely get enough calories to survive back in the hunter-gatherer times, right? So today, where those foods are not rare, at least in the developed world, where it's very easy to get your hands on really sugary, really fatty foods, it has actually become a detriment. And so the pleasure does not quite align with what is beneficial to you. So it is a really interesting sort of shift there.
Yeah.
But generally, I think there is a lot of just hedonism as a general principle that guides many decisions in people's lives, if not all of them, right? Uh, I'm not. A lot of these philosophies, I would say, people fall into more than one. But
one last quick note about hedonism.
Mm.
I think it's sort of unfair to represent it as simply the pursuit of happiness, because, like, historically, I think it is more aligned with, like, doing sinful things and giving into those kinds of desires. So I think maybe Aristotle has more of a system of thought aligned with pursuing happiness. Hedonism seems to me, at least, and historically, to signify that you're indulging in, like, sexual pleasures or pleasures that actually do not produce happiness, but just because like they fulfill your desire, and you should always just fulfill your desires. So I'm not sure if we were completely accurate, but I do think that there are definitely elements of it that apply to us today.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting. I guess there needs to be a different, its own philosophy for that. But maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain is sort of attributed to hedonism, right?
Yeah.
So I would argue that emotional and mental pleasure and pain is even more important than physical pleasure and pain. You know, so I think that, I don't know, maybe it has to affect our conception of hedonism.
Maybe that's something that people have overlooked, especially in like the colloquial definition of it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that about does that.
All right. So the next philosophy we have is postmodernism, which is also like a literary and artistic movement, but it's also a philosophical one.
Yeah, it's very
and it is sort of
Yeah, I'm just gonna say it's very contrarian. It's just the opposite of it, or the rejection of modernism is postmodernism. You also see it in art. It's also an artistic movement, the postmodernist movement. But in philosophy, it's shifting away from the grand themes that were established, like by, I guess, past generations is the best way to describe it. It's the rejection of grand theories, I would say. But in like art and like why we have Pulp Fiction up here, Pulp Fiction is out of what I've seen out of Tarantino, I think it's my favorite Tarantino movie. I like it, and Quentin Tarantino is one of the most famous postmodernist artists, one of the most famous postmodernist directors, based on how he structures things. Like when someone says we're gonna Tarantino it, that means that they're gonna start in an unchronological order. They're gonna present something to you that is not in chronological order. But Tarantino also does a lot of other things, because he presents movies, for example, in chapters. Like Pulp Fiction is divided into 7 chapters. Usually you would not experience a movie in chapters. That's a very strange way to present a film to someone. And it's that departure from modernism, because modernism would just be start and it's just a movie, right? But Tarantino is like, no, middle, it's the beginning of the start, the end of the start, the beginning of the end, the middle again. You know, he like mixes up the timeline, and then he presents it to you in like chapters or something. All of that stuff, it is that kind of stuff. I find it very enjoyable to me, because it inspires uniqueness, I guess, because to depart from what has already been established forces you to establish something new, I guess. And we also mentioned this before before we went on stream about how eventually the postmodernist stuff will become the modern stuff, because if you just continually depart from modernism and you keep establishing things that are anti-establishment, eventually the anti-establishments will outweigh the establishments, and they will become the new establishment, and you will have to depart from that as well if you want to continue.
You'll have to do postmodernism.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, it is interesting. I would say postmodernism as a philosophy is sort of similar to nihilism in some ways. I hope that is not an unfair characterization, but part of it is sort of denying that there is an absolute truth, and denying that there is an absolute morality, because those are modernist ideas, or at least ideas used in modernism. They go farther back, but it is sort of interesting. Postmodernism, I don't know. As a philosophy, I see it as sort of related to nihilism to a certain extent, and you can sort of see that in the artistic expression of postmodernism, in that a lot of postmodernist artwork, like, intentionally just does whatever, if you know what I mean, like saying the things that we value about art aren't actually true. And so that is sort of going into aesthetics, but it's like, it's saying, why should this technique in art, which people perceive to be aesthetically pleasing, why should that be accepted as aesthetically pleasing? So I'm not going to do that. It's like the aesthetical equivalent of what they believe ethically, right?
Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting. Postmodernism is like, what would you say? It's like the prevailing philosophy of today.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know what you guys think about that.
A large portion of like millennials and Gen Z, big postmodernism, big rejection of what is, rejection of large scale social constructs, rejection of moral constructs. I've seen this very often in like dating. Just like, that's something that I've noticed is very different, like in how someone from Gen Z might go and pursue a romantic partner is starkly different to how someone from like our Gen X or parents' generation would have pursued someone while they were the same age as us, for example. It is it's an incredibly
now, could that be technology thing. So part of it, like, what do you methods, like, and the morals behind it?
So part of it is absolutely technology, because obviously our parents would have been able to, say, date someone like over the internet. It would have taken a really long time, because they would have had to wait for like the dial up and all of that. Like, what are you doing? And 3 hours later they're like, nothing much. You know, it would be horrible. But there's a significant moral change too. For example, it's much more acceptable for someone to be talking to multiple people, to be pursuing multiple people at the same time. That's a Gen Z philosophy. That is, and it's a departure from the modern thing, which is pursue one partner, or pursue one person that you're interested in. That has kind of, obviously it's not unheard of anymore, like, and it still prevails to some extent, but there is a grand departure from that, and that's just one very specific theme. Again, with other stuff like just like morals in general, I'm just trying to think of other examples. Like I would
definitely
say,
get it.
Gen Z kind of has a reputation for having a very foul language, I would say. Like, I've heard a lot more kids just dropping bombs all over the place, much more than, we heard in our childhood, and definitely that our parents heard, because, swearing or using cuss words that's a taboo. That's a modern taboo. The departure from that is, kids just not following that taboo,
Yeah.
Also, I think
Yeah.
postmodernism, people aren't necessarily just rejecting everything for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think it becomes even more powerful when it's a deliberate rejection of something that's a grand theory that has no merit. I don't think people are necessarily rejecting like things like freedom or, I don't know, the free market that have existed for so long. People might be like starting to slightly reject those, but for the most part, people are trying to attack things that they feel have no like ethical base and that are just simply established traditions. But I think, like in the example of Pulp Fiction, the movie still relies on a lot of modern tropes, even though it is presented in a postmodern way. It's sort of like it's a blend of the two. It's never just a complete rejection. And people that are challenging modern ideals, they do so with reasoning that has been, perfected for thousands of years.
Yeah,
so
and
that's why postmodernism is such an interesting philosophy to me, and an interesting like historical development that's constantly happening,
and a necessary one.
Yeah,
for philosophical thought to prevail, it needs to continually be questioned. And there are a lot of philosophical, I guess, thought patterns that question themselves. Like Socrates, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Stuff like that. It is the constant questioning and reevaluation of a line of thinking that either proves it or disproves it. It either strengthens it or it annihilates it. And I think it's valuable.
The only thing I would say, and I definitely agree with Zach that this isn't most people, but I do think that there can be a sort of naive postmodernism, and that's just basically it is old, therefore it is bad, and that is just obviously a problem because it's just as damaging as saying it is old, therefore it is good, right? Both of those ideas are not really going to give you something coherent and productive. So you definitely need to examine things objectively without an attachment to like tradition, right? Without an attachment to or a hatred of tradition. You just have to look at it as it is and say, is this beneficial or not? And so that is a productive way to do postmodernism.
We have some chat from Daikaiju Productions.
All right. Daikaiju Productions says, when postmodernism becomes modernism, you have become the very thing you swore to destroy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that about does it for postmodernism. Makes for good art, not gonna lie. Like, abstract art, but there are some pieces of postmodernism art that I'm like, all right, you got it, buddy. But again, art is subjective, and that's aesthetics, and that falls under axiology. So, and this obviously does too. This is heavy axiology because it is the reevaluation of past morals and past preferences towards things. But yeah, there you go.
Interesting. Yeah. All right.
We go over...
the next one is Confucianism.
Yes. So
Confucianism obviously centers around Confucius, who was a philosopher, I guess you could say, and this is a sort of like East Asian philosophy. It's also sometimes described as a religion, but it is, I would say, it's kind of interesting because it doesn't really have a god, so you could describe it as a philosophy. But I suppose you could probably describe every religion as a philosophy as well, right? It's sort of interesting.
Yeah, I would not call Confucianism a religion, especially because that portion, like you could call it more of a spirituality, I would say, especially taking into account that this is from China, which is a historically irreligious place. It's much more a place of spirituality, similar to some of its Southeast Asian neighbors. But and we have the four tenets of Confucianism up, and Confucianism was basically Confucius having a theory, and he was around 500 BC, I think. Yeah, around the year 500 BC. He was born in 551 BC, and he died in 479 BC. Basically trying to teach people on how to live the most pure life, or how to live the most fulfilling life. And so there are those four tenets, and he basically was like, hey, do these things, be wise, be helpful to your community, be loyal, have piety, continence, and righteousness. And there you go. And it's very easy to think that some people might have taken that and been like, oh, okay, so if I'm loyal and I'm righteous, I'll get into heaven, or I will get into, or I'll reach nirvana, or stuff like that. But Confucius himself, I don't believe he tied it to any sort of afterlife thing. He was much more focused on the now and how can I live a more fulfilling life right now.
Yeah, it is interesting. It is sort of the moral framework of that area of the world. At one point, there was like one of the dynasties. There's like so many in China, like all of the different dynasties in history. But at one point, they had like a merit like examination system, or it might have been Japan. I forget. But one of them, they did like, basically you had to take an exam and know the Confucian principles well in order to get a position in the government, which is sort of interesting. So it's like you'd take a test on Confucianism if you wanted to get into the government, and that would determine what job you get.
It was established as the official, I guess, line of thinking of one of the dynasties of China. I think it was the Han Dynasty. It was established as like the official national belief system was Confucianism. And, going back to, is it a religion, is it a spirituality? Confucius did have ideas on things such as cosmic harmony, which, again, I would say is much more spiritual, because that's something that also falls, or that's pretty much the main point of the next one that we're going to hit, which is probably the most famous line of thinking to come out, or philosophy to come out of China. But Confucius himself believed in a cosmic harmony, that, hey, if you follow these four tenets and if you live life as being righteous, you will, you'll be good for the cosmic harmony, stuff like that. And he also created the golden rule, do unto others as you would wish others to do unto you. So, pretty interesting thought. It seems very commonplace for us to just think about that, but, what he's doing there is promoting empathy, and, you love to see it. But, I think it's valuable. Things like that. It's much more direct than other philosophies, I would say, because other philosophies are like, all right, this is how we're going to reason out things, or this is what our ethical principles should be based upon, and then from that code you then respond accordingly. Whereas I feel like Confucianism is a little more direct, where it's like you got to be loyal to your family, straight to the principles. Which
you would think though then that it would be easy to follow, right? But we can see from the course of modern history that China is definitely strayed very far from Confucius and principles. So maybe there's some evidence to make the argument that it's almost too simple in a way, and he, by believing that humans were inherently good and improvable, there's not enough like risk for not following the principles.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But
Well, I would say it's more like that a different philosophy came in and like won people over better.
and
Well,
let's
maybe
let's
then you
talk
could
about
say that
that.
the most well-tempered philosophies are easily like overtaken, like popular
Mm.
ones that have some sort of like driving ideas behind them. This one seems to me to be very like chill and easy to
Mm.
follow, right? But it doesn't
Yeah, it's
have
just
the
like
same.
respect your family,
Yeah, it doesn't have the
don't
same
betray people.
the same well, revolutionary sentiments as others could.
Hmm. Yeah. Basically, we're alluding to Marxism is listed as a philosophy, but then obviously it's also a political ideology. There are a few different philosophies that are like philosophies, but then also political ideologies like liberalism, libertarianism, legalism. So we chose not to include them on this slide because this is more about philosophy than politics. But anyway.
Yeah. But the most famous one that came out of China is the next one we're going to talk about. I think this flows pretty nicely into that one,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
is
Taoism
yeah.
or Taoism. Either one is
There are
acceptable, I
two
think.
wolves inside you. One smokes
Mm,
crack. The other smokes
no.
crack. You are addicted to crack. But
Yeah,
no,
that's the meme.
yeah,
Um,
I love it.
but yeah, so Taoism is sort of about the balance between like good and evil. That's the symbol here, the yin yang symbol. Uh, it's about the balance between like light and dark, good and evil, the different sort of forces, like equal and opposite forces in the world. And that is pretty interesting. It's sort of like an acceptance of like you can't have good without bad,
Hmm.
which is sort of an interesting principle.
Yeah,
But
There are other parallels that you'll also see later about the
mhm,
importance of pain. So you could say this is sort of the rejection of just like hedonism, because hedonism
mm,
just tips the balance in favor of one
mhm,
thing. Um,
yeah,
we also included Star Wars
hmm,
trilogy, but also just myth in general, has embodied this idea forever. It's like the inner struggles of good and evil,
mm,
and you can imagine we wouldn't really exist. Like, the human race would be so boring without the struggle.
mhm,
um, so the balance maybe seems to suggest that good and bad are both actually
mhm,
just evils. You can't just
mm.
eliminate one in favor of the other.
yeah,
Yeah, and it goes back to the wolves. That's like it's about inside, like in your head, like you as a person. There's both good forces and desires and like things you want to do, and then there's bad forces and desires. And so I guess it's like acknowledging the balance between them, but
hmm,
what does it say about how you should act, right? What does Taoism say about how you should act? Because I would imagine that they would say you should try to act good, even acknowledging that there will be good and bad in the world. I think there's like a distinction there, but I
yeah.
don't know enough
Again,
about it.
yeah. It's less, much less direct than Confucianism, because this is
Hmm.
more like traditional philosophy. It's you should see things this way instead of you should act this way.
Yeah.
You A big part of it is rejection of absolutism. Even the symbol itself, the yin yang symbol, there is bad in the good and there's good in the bad. There is no absolute evil and there is no absolute good. So even the best person
Hmm.
has like some evil aspect to them, and even the worst person has some good in them. So they the Chinese people, when this was popularized, when this spread across China, they found it pretty useful, because, I mean, like, the entire world at that point in time, probably it was not fun to live in that era. You know,
In the ancient world.
In the ancient world.
Yeah.
So it's a way of being like, there is, for every ounce of suffering, there is an ounce of pleasure to be had. You know? So it's a way of kind of rationalizing your own suffering, which is very valuable. And that's why this has persisted. I would say it has definitely beaten out Confucianism. And I think that's even what it did historically, is it beat out Confucianism. And that principle of balancing good and evil is something you see, like, everywhere today. Again, like, either in, like, Star Wars and in other media stuff, or in, like, other myths. But it's definitely an idea that has stuck around, and it's valuable.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Guess we can go on to the next one.
Right. Yeah, next one. So it's kind of similar in a certain extent. Stoicism. So, again, it's about, like, accepting the negative things that occur in your life. But, yeah, do one of you guys want to explain it more?
Yeah.
We have our Stoic expert here.
Yes.
Yeah.
I am a huge proponent of Stoicism. I'm going to quote my favorite president, give us a brief explanation of Stoicism. So, if you're wondering, my favorite president is Teddy Roosevelt.
Same
he
here.
said that nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain, and difficulty. I have never in my life envied a human being who led an easy life. I have envied a great many people who led difficult lives and led them well. So, Stoicism is essentially striving to accomplish things that are going to better the common good, regardless of the personal sacrifice that it might cost. And really, a lot of Stoics talk about accepting death instead of trying to avoid it. One of my favorite Stoics is Seneca. He wrote a collection of letters while he was sick and dying, and he progressively came to terms with his illness because he didn't really see death as the ultimate end to everything that he had accomplished. Because, like I said, he had made sacrifices in his life for the betterment of others, and he had enjoyed his life by accepting his fate and everything that happened to him, whether it was good or bad.
Yeah.
So, Stoicism also, is it about, like, accepting your suffering? Like, it's sort of about making sure that your happiness isn't based on the external, like, circumstances. Like, it's about in your own mind. Like, you have to maintain your composure even if negative things are occurring to you and around you, right? Like, it's about sort of bearing the suffering, and it's like difficult. It's like not giving into it. It's like saying it doesn't matter. What matters is, like, my internal peace, right?
Yeah,
I may be getting that wrong.
Like, essentially Stoic myths that I'm pretty sure Marcus Aurelius wrote about is this story of the supposed Roman general that gets captured and tortured with poison as well as, like, needles and other stuff. And every time they torture him, he laughs. And he's basically saying that, like, he has his freedom of conscience, and, like, they can't take that away from him regardless of, you know, whatever happens to him, because he was just that, like, attuned to his own, like, physical presence, and he was that willing to not let, like, evil corrupt his ability to be happy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
that's
like, Stoics are all buff as hell, apparently, going by these images, probably because they just work through the pain. They're like, going.
Yeah.
We're doing it. But they are really a lot of heroes. Like if you look at heroes, both like past and present, they are usually stoics to some degree. Like it's become much more of a trend to kind of humanize heroes a little bit more. Like the Marvel universe is what's come to mind with that one. They try to humanize the heroes a lot more, but usually, like just like for most of history, the ideal people are stoics. Like the ideal people are people that can move on through hard times and who show no fear and who accept the challenges that they face and face them with bravery. Things like that. So stoicism has pretty much always been an ideal pattern of thinking. It's always been an ideal philosophy. And I think it's shown to be an incredibly helpful one. We have Marcus Aurelius up there, who is probably the most famous Stoic, and he was able to. He was the king, right? He was one of the kings of Rome.
Yeah, I think he ruled for a period of time.
Yeah, and he's usually regarded. I'm pretty sure he was a decent leader, or at least he led with a very good mindset. And again, Teddy Roosevelt, also my favorite president. Love him. And he was a fantastic president. Let's just throw that on the table. There's a reason he's on Mount Rushmore. But he was able to lead with that mindset. And the country he led was benefited by that mindset. So
Another great one.
Well, it's also interesting because he's a person that dealt with a lot of suffering in his life.
Mm-hmm.
Like his whole childhood, he grew up like very sick, like very ill.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he grew up, like he tried to like work out more essentially, and like he went out west to try and like become more rugged.
Yeah.
And then like his like wife died on the same day that his mother died.
His mom died.
Right.
Yeah.
Like so so then he dealt with like a ton of like different suffering. And so, but then he just went on past it. He dealt with it, and then became president.
What were you going to say, Zach?
Yeah. Another neat little historical connection to Stoicism is the civil rights movement. I think, especially at least Martin Luther King's way of protesting reflects Stoic values extremely well, because essentially the idea of nonviolent protest is to bear sacrifices and to put oneself in tremendous danger for the chance of accomplishing a great good. And I think Martin Luther King bore pretty much everything throughout his life, even having to pay like the ultimate price for his visions. And I think, it's unfortunate that many people that practice Stoicism will end in such a way, but it also is such a powerful philosophy.
Yeah.
Because of the change it can generate.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that about does that for that. But I'm sure we could talk about that one for hours.
Oh, yeah.
All right, next up, cynicism.
All right, the next one. Cynicism. So what exactly is cynicism?
Just like distrusting everyone, believing that everyone is inherently bad. It's like the famous example is they see the glass half empty, and they also think that the person that owns the glass is like not nice and they shouldn't have a conversation with them.
Interesting. So it's like, why exactly is everyone bad?
If you're familiar with like Leviathan and Hobbes, it's basically like people will inherently, in a state of nature, do evil things and become lawless unless there's some sort of like order or system that keeps them in check. But cynicism even goes farther than that, because a lot of the times people are cynical of that system as well. So they believe that humans are inherently evil, but they also believe that like the government that is supposed to negate that never does its job. So if you look at these cats we have up on the slide right now, we got a Chad cat in the middle. I don't really understand why that is depicted in that way. The cynic is on the right side of the spectrum.
The soy
to the
jack.
diagram, it's a win-lose strategy because you're prepared for the worst, but by believing that everyone's bad, you don't really get yourself into situations that you can benefit from as much as the positive cynic, which is kind of an oxymoron. Yeah.
Yeah, look at that cat in the middle. That is literally just a Chad cat.
Yeah.
But
the most famous.
But yeah, it is sort of. Yeah.
I'm just going to talk about the most famous of the cynics, which is Diogenes, who is insane and just an absolute mad lad. He lived in a barrel, and he was just basically known for not having a lot of respect for people and for challenging the ideas of a lot of significant figures like Plato, as well as, you know, there was a meeting between him and Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great, like, he basically disrespected him. I don't remember the exact details of it, but a lot of people were positively influenced by him. Like, Alexander the Great became a fan of Diogenes after talking to him, and Diogenes, like, disrespected him. That's something that he's not used to, being Alexander the Great, the guy that never lost a battle, you know? So, things like that. Cynicism is... It might sound like it's just not a great thing to live by, but some people are able to profit off of it because it does say it's a win-lose scenario, or a win-lose strategy, but I feel like you can definitely come out on top.
Well, it is interesting because I believe that there is definitely a sort of positive cynicism in that, like, people, I guess, I would say it's like kind of foolish as a cynic to believe people are just going to behave evil for the sake of doing evil, right? But I think a better way to understand it might be that people are going to act in their own self-interest. Like, people are going to act selfishly, and like for their own benefit. And if you understand that, then you can sort of behave accordingly. If you know what I mean. Like, so if people are only acting in their own self-interest, then I guess that sort of informs how you should act. I don't know, maybe in your own self-interest, but it's difficult. It's
kind of like a prisoner's dilemma to some degree. It's like, if everyone is out only for their self-interest, then you must also only be out for your self-interest. Because if you help someone and their interests only align with themselves, they will take advantage of you. So it becomes a prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, it is really difficult. But then I guess a positive place is if you can set up a mutually beneficial agreement with someone where betraying the other's trust for both parties, or like wronging the other person, is going to be a detriment to both. If you understand the cynical mindset, then you can sort of set something up like that, accept that, and like enter a situation like that. And it would benefit you and the other person to like cooperate. Because like full-on cynicism would be like the person's gonna not cooperate even though that damages themselves. Like, I just don't think that's realistic. I don't know. Like, full-on cynicism is just people are gonna act evil no matter what. That just doesn't really make sense, I guess. Because in some situations, to act evil requires you to negatively affect yourself, to sort of cut off your nose to spite your face. And most people don't do that, I feel. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not a cynic. But yeah. So there you go.
Yeah, that's what I got. Transcendentalism. Reject humanity.
Yeah.
Return to monkey.
Yes. So transcendentalism is another philosophy that's also a literary movement. You've got Henry Thoreau, Ralph Emerson, and Walt Whitman. And they sort of, it's an interesting philosophy. It's very heavily connected with nature, and very opposed to a lot of the developments from the Industrial Revolution that were occurring during the time in the 1800s. So it's just like live at peace with nature, like live a simple life. Don't indulge in like excess things. If you live a simple life, then you will like spiritually have a greater experience. One of these three, I forget which, they're kind of interchangeable, those three authors. People are probably not going to like that statement. But one of them said, like, I strive for every meal to be less than 5 ingredients. So they wanted every meal they ate to be less than 5 ingredients in it. Things like that. It's just simplicity as much as possible. And then, of course, nature. One of them like lived out by a pond, right? And then in like a little cabin.
Thoreau.
It's
most of them.
Yeah, Thoreau.
They all like nature.
Probably they all did.
But
yeah,
also,
it's yeah.
It sort of exhibits like, I feel like it was a postmodern response to the developments of technology of the Industrial Revolution. It was basically like a distrust of the mass theory that like, we should just become super technologically advanced and mass produce things, and we should, trust religion instead of nature in all cases. They also had a mass distrust of the government. Like Thoreau specifically wrote a lot about civil disobedience and not abiding by an unjust law. So,
and he like committed tax evasion and
yes,
got jailed for it, I think. Yeah, very interesting people here. But yeah, I definitely like the naturalism aspect. Just sort of like nature, serene, peaceful. I think everyone can understand that appeal, right? And I definitely think that there is a sort of like inner peace and maybe like a spirituality that can come from being in nature a lot. And that's just more pure naturalism. But there's a lot more that comes with transcendentalism, of course, just because of the things that were happening at the time that it came to be. So, yeah.
So what are the transcendental numbers?
Oh, that's just like, I don't really know.
Okay, so
it's a math thing,
transcendental
but
numbers because they derive from nature and they cannot be expressed through integers. So, like, for example, pi is a number deriving from like the area of a circle. It only makes sense naturally. It repeats forever and ever, like, because it's not meant to be quantified by.
Oh, I got you.
Like Euler's number. Similar, right? It derives from like decay and growth rates and stuff like that. So the concept of transcendental numbers is the same as transcendentalism, which is just like deriving everything from nature and not creating unnecessary burdens that don't actually express things very well. So like integers could be seen as like completely arbitrary. Like what is the number one besides, the number one meaning one thing?
Mm-hmm.
Still, like inventing new technologies to a transcendentalist, if they don't have a clear purpose, they are seen as negative.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know you have to go soon, but I was hoping that we could get through the next 3 with you, if that's okay, Zach.
Yeah, sure. I can. No, I can finish it off. There are only 8 more. I have enough time.
Oh, okay.
Nice. All
Cool.
right, so we go over to humanism.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't really know much about this one.
This is a closely related to transcendentalism, with a focus instead of nature being on humans. I found this British human society that is very interesting to me. There's stuff like Scientology, and there's some philosophical schools that still exist today, but it's kind of rare that you find like a modern day society that is supporting like a specific school. I thought it was interesting that their logo is the worst rendition of the Da Vinci painting of a man I have ever seen. Like it does not even resemble the Da Vinci painting of a man. Like only barely. It looks like someone's doing the YMCA dance.
Interesting.
But as you can see, it's just like seeing the world as a natural place, having humans at the center of morals, flourishing, like championing human rights. Albert Einstein,
so it's like
grabbed a quote from just because he also like expresses like scientific knowledge over other things.
Mm-hmm. So it's like kind of like improving. It's like treating people fairly, right? It's like it's just trying to, I guess, respect other people.
Yeah, you could look at it as building off of atheistic existentialism and saying that not only is there meaning in the universe that doesn't require God, it is necessary for everyone to contribute to the betterment and procurement of this meaning, not just for themselves, but for others. Because that's like what being inherently human is all about.
Interesting.
It makes me think of the 14th Amendment, honestly.
Yeah. Equal protection under the law.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely a more like more social one. And I feel like that's not really reflected by too many other philosophies. Usually they're more like kind of focused on the individual, but I feel like humanism is one that really no one person can achieve humanism. It kind of seems like you need to be in a community, you need to be in a society to achieve it, which is interesting. I think that sets it aside from a lot of other ones, because you can be a stoic all by yourself. In fact, it's probably pretty easy to be a stoic all by yourself. All that kind of stuff. So that's very interesting to me.
Yeah.
I feel like one nation worlds would definitely be more humanist. Like Star Trek seems to be.
Oh yeah, Star Trek. Humanist. Interesting. Yeah, it is. It's interesting because I feel like all the other philosophies can sort of like their principles can be used to justify things that like negatively affect people, right? But humanism is like about trying to positively influence humanity, with that as its center focus, rather than the philosophy starting with certain principles and then saying these principles will lead to good. Humanism is saying like we should seek out good for all human beings. So that is very interesting. A bit hard to achieve, probably.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest roadblock a humanist might run into is a situation where, in order to benefit one human, you have to negatively affect another. And that's not all situations, right? Like, life isn't entirely a zero-sum game, but there are definitely individual circumstances that might be like that. And the difficulty is, how do we handle that if we're humanists? How do we deal with circumstances where, to improve one person's life, we have to negatively affect another person's life, like possibly drastically? That I would say is probably the main downfall. But ideally, if cases like that didn't pop up, humanism would make the most sense, just because it's like, let's help everyone.
We have some chat.
So, alrighty. Okay. Roxanne Stephenson says, heavy stuff. Checking in. Good job. And then Daikaiju Productions says, when they torture him, he laughs. That's not stoicism, that's just masochism. Or is stoicism just an intellectual masochism?
Yeah. I mean, it's not like they're inviting pain.
Kind of.
But they're just going about it in a non-traditional way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Over on to idealism, which we were talking about a lot earlier, especially with the Ship of Theseus. So this one is the counter to realism, which is the next one we'll talk about. But both are epistemology, because they both concern what is truth. And idealism is the principle that we derive our own truth, or that the absolute truth is whatever our perception of things are. So however you perceive something, however you like see something, whatever merit or meaning you give any individual object or concept, that is how it is in reality. It's kind of strange, because that would mean that everyone is living in their own reality, which could be seen as true for a lot of people, especially when you compare people across the globe with different societies, even with different social ethoses. It would be very hard to just swap societies, even disregarding things such as like monetary income, or the economic success of any individual colony, country, or community. Just swapping into a different society would be difficult, because different cultural values and stuff. But sitting down with those people and talking to them, you would realize that you're almost experiencing completely different realities. The extreme of this is brainwashing. Like, brainwash people from, I guess North Korea is the best example. They are living in a reality where Kim Jong-un is some superhero that can, fight the sun and was born as the result of a dying star, or something like that, whatever they believe. They are living in that reality, whereas we clearly are not. And you could make the argument that, hey, well, we know he wasn't, born as the result of some cosmic alliance, because, science and all that. But idealism just says that for those people, they wholeheartedly believe that, and that is their reality, and therefore that reality is true. So this basically means that there is no absolute truth. It's a rejection of absolutism. There is no absolute shared truth. The only absolute truth is the one you believe in, and that will differ from the next guy. Like, even two twins that grew up together and did everything, together, they will eventually develop different lines of thinking and will live in different realities. So each individual person has constructed reality, or is perceiving reality based solely on their ideals, hence idealism.
Interesting.
It is also,
Yeah, that is difficult.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
it is also kind of the concept that we should strive for the best possible scenario, even if it isn't something that's real or feasibly achievable. So, like you said, it requires, to some extent, everyone to be in their own reality, but it also requires everyone to be able to envision something that is ideal, that is like beyond what we can conceptualize today, even. And I think one of the origins of it is definitely from Plato's philosophy, where he talks about some of the like ideal horses and ideal objects that are, you know, the most beautiful or the best objectively, and that it's really hard to conceptualize something like that because, you know, everyone is going to have different thoughts about it. And I think oftentimes what one group of people thinks is like super idealistic and good, or even progress in general, like one of the paintings I included on this slide, American Progress. The ideals that are being like pushed in the painting in reality, like realistically, are not nearly as good as they're portrayed or imagined in people's minds. So there is a great conflict between like idealistic and pragmatic thinking.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this,
yeah, it is difficult, I would say, because if reality is whatever individuals perceive it to be, then I mean it's hard to like make any informed decision if you can't know what reality is. Like, I guess if you're an individual, then your decisions are just going to be informed by your ideal perception of reality. But it makes it difficult to make decisions as a group because everyone will disagree about what is reality and therefore what is the best course of action. So idealism can be difficult. But then at the same time, there is an extent that just everything is idealism and everyone is idealistic, because what can you say is the truth? Like, who determines what is true? Someone has to determine it because we're all humans. There is no like external entity to say this is what is true. Absolutely. It's all just humans or groups of humans. And the result of that is even what we may think of as reality is actually just the result of the biases of different people.
Yeah. And this is...
So it's both...
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is obviously kind of directly counter, I'd say pretty much the exact opposite of realism, which is the next one.
Yeah.
And realism,
so realism says that there is an objective reality, that there is one universal truth, there is one way at looking at things that is right, and there are other ways that are wrong. And I suppose the difficulty with realism is finding the truth.
Yeah. There are often scenarios where it seems like the truth is convoluted or multiple things could be true, but often you have to examine the context. And something closely associated with realism is pragmatism. And just pragmatic thinking in general is thinking of what will be the most logical and most effective thing to implement in the real world. You can't really, if you're a realist, like think too much about minute details that might upset your perception of the truth, because pragmatically you don't have the time to consider them, and they just will inhibit progress in general. One interesting connection, like we said before, philosophy often connects to science and art. Um, Pragmatic linguistics is a specific branch of linguistics in which they look at the true meaning of a certain saying based on context clues. So, like, if you look at the fish is ready to eat, so there's this very strangely cropped cartoon of a fish ordering food. And it's kind of confusing to me how this image came to be. But obviously, depending on the context, it could mean that you were served fish, or it could mean that a fish was eating something. But there is a truth. You just have to be willing to uncover it based on the context and the situation.
Interesting.
Yeah. Both, both idealism and realism. Again, I see them similar to the optimism and pessimism thing. It's like using them in isolated scenarios is probably the best way to intake them. I do feel like people would align themselves one way or the other, and that'd be the one that they tend to. But there's nothing saying that in an individual circumstance you can't employ some realist ideals, even though that kind of sounds a little strange.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, because I would say ideally we would live in a world of realism, but realistically we live in a world of idealism, which is like the worst. And what I mean by that is that we all would like to know the truth. We would like for everyone to know what the truth is, just based on the facts of the situation, and everyone
that's really
to
not
act
a bad
accordingly.
Quote. That's a good quote. I like it.
Yeah, and but then the reality of the situation is that the world is too complicated for everyone to see a self-evident truth. Like, people can understand 2 + 2 is 4, but then, there's like 197 countries and there's like 8 billion people on the planet. And it's like, how could you possibly hope to understand everything about reality? And so you have to make judgment calls. You have to sort of make an opinion. And like, you'll get two conflicting things. I mean, we don't have a perfect historical record, for instance. So you'll have to just choose at some point which historical interpretation of an event you think is more meritable. And so, or meritus, I don't know, has more merit. And the result of that is that we can't live in a world of realism because the world is too complicated. So, yeah, although we sort of strive toward realism, we still have to deal with idealism. And so, again, back to that very strange quote. Ideally, we would live in a world of realism, but realistically, we live in a world of idealism.
There you go. Next up, we get to transhumanism.
Right. Yeah, transhumanism. So I like transhumanism. It's basically the belief in transcending the human body. It's the belief that scientific progress and development will improve human lives, as it has done largely for the past centuries. And we should continue to pursue scientific progress in order to improve human lives. And ultimately, like, you know, the idea would be to allow for like body modification and then maybe eventually like computer program uploading, right? Like biological immortality, technological immortality, that kind of thing is associated with transhumanism. I'm a fan. Personally, I'm a fan of transhumanism because I like technology. So,
I'm a fan
now,
of transhumanism until they execute Order 66.
Yeah, there's a great deal of fear with like artificial intelligence and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And it's a natural fear because, you know, it's the fear of the unknown. A lot of the technology we require to do all this stuff is, you know, largely unknown. We've talked about this on stream quite a lot with our, like, any of the ones where we're talking about technology of the future. That stuff, to be able to code someone's, like, personality into a computer obviously takes, like, an incredible amount of computing power, but computing power is only going up, and at a pretty exponential rate if you look at like over time. And a lot of people are worried about like their identity not being fully transcribed from biological to technological, and really only time will tell the success of those. But I do feel like it is something we should at least strive for, because robots, they can't get sick, and even if you don't want to commit fully to being an artificial intelligence, which I can completely understand, it's very nice to have a heart that doesn't fail or kidneys that won't die prematurely. And even just that, it doesn't take away from who you are, but it improves your current state and allows you to just enjoy other things more. Because, if you can't go on like your daily jog because, I don't know, you're paralyzed, it might be nice to have like a spine that helps you walk. And that stuff is achieved through technology.
Yeah, well, I have a little question about mind uploading, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very rhetorical question. You'll quickly understand it. But what if one neuron is replaced by a technological equivalent? And then what if a second neuron is replaced by a technological equivalent?
I haven't heard
and then
this
eventually,
one before.
Yeah, exactly. The ship of Theseus problem presents itself quite plainly in the mind uploading problem.
I cannot even
go ahead,
begin to answer that. But yeah, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Yeah,
Zach?
what were you going to say, Zach?
I was just going to say that transhumanism, to me, feels more like a technological goal than a specific philosophy. Because I think, at least in terms of other schools of thought, technology and advancement have always been kind of separated from humans. So their unification in this way would kind of be like a point of contention if you're going off previous schools of thought. Like humanism, on one hand, would support it because, it could elongate human life. It would help advance human rights. I think the point where some schools of thought would stop supporting it is once the modifications are not happening just to those that have a legitimate disability, but when people start getting modifications that make everyone more or less the same, and everyone have the exact same capabilities, that's where you would see, transcendentalists and Stoics, and even
the transcendentalists don't like
even hedonists
transhumanism.
Might start to disagree with some of the principles of transhumanism.
Interesting, because I would say that hedonism is largely aligned with transhumanism, right? Because a lot of the technological progress that we've been making has been in an effort to increase pleasure and decrease pain, right? Like think of all the new medicines and all the new techniques. All of that is in an effort to improve the quality of life and length of life in human beings. And then a lot of our technologies like computers and phones, it's for communication, but then it's also for entertainment, to increase the pleasure that people experience.
That's true.
And also related to hedonism is, if you look at the more negative aspects of hedonism, the more giving into your base desires and vice and stuff like that. I would say that the internet has created new vices like addiction to social media. So it is interesting. I feel like transhumanism and hedonism are closely related. I feel like transhumanism at the very least is sort of founded on hedonism, because transhumanism is saying that technology will improve people's lives. It will make them happier. Therefore, it's good. And that would be a hedonistic principle, that something that increases pleasure and decreases pain is good. Therefore, if technology increases pleasure and decreases pain, then it must be good and it must be pursued.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really think about that. The reason I originally said they might be opposed to some aspects of it is that, like, hedonists usually live without, like, much regard to their, like, immortals, like, long run state. So if they were given the option to, like, be immortal, I feel like they would easily get bored of the pleasures that they were pursuing, because part of the reason that made the, like, hedonists get so drawn to certain pleasures is actually the risks associated with them, and the feeling that, like, they can live with, like, reckless abandon without having, like, to know that they'll always wake up the next day. It's kind of like, I mean, people do drugs because it gives them euphoria, but there's also that element of danger involved. And I originally thought, like, you know, if you could just become a robot and you could do as much cocaine as you wanted and there would be zero side effects, that hedonists would not like that because it would take away the danger aspect of it. But I see, like, with some of the other more common pleasures, technology caters perfectly to them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you think about it, right, say that you experience 10 pleasure units a day, right? Living a longer life will increase the amount of pleasure you feel. Therefore, it will maximize pleasure.
As long as you don't get too bored.
Yeah, that is true. But an infinite lifespan, I guess, is the opportunity to experience an infinite amount of pleasure. And therefore, I imagine hedonists would like transhumanism. The place where hedonists might separate from transhumanism is if they don't agree with that core principle of transhumanism, that is, technology and technological progress is actually something that increases pleasure and decreases pain. If hedonists say, and of course, this would probably be a split amongst hedonists, but I think it could be a valid argument to say, no, technology doesn't actually increase pleasure and decrease pain. I don't agree with that, but you could definitely see people that say that, because that's more with the transcendentalist philosophy, that it isn't actually improving society. Progress isn't actually improving people's lives, it's actually making it worse. So if there is a hedonist that believes that technological progress is actually increasing the amount of pain or decreasing the amount of pleasure, then they would be opposed to transhumanism. It's all about whether or not technology increases pleasure and decreases pain. That's the extent to which they align. So again, really interesting. I like transhumanism. I'm gonna say that. That's I think it's a good philosophy.
Yeah. All right. Next one is materialism. We have become barcode.
Exactly. Yeah, materialism, I guess, is it. Again, it's more looked at as like a societal criticism, like, oh, Americans are so materialistic, they just want things. But as a basic philosophy, materialism is that material objects and material pleasures are, I guess, the purpose of life, will make my life better. Having things will make my life better. So you could say it's related to hedonism.
It's also
just in that, yeah.
Part of it is preference for the material world. It's kind of a rejection. So it does fall under metaphysics, but it's kind of a rejection of the metaphysical world. If you follow me, it's giving supremacy to the material world because that's what we can interact with, and that's what interacts with us. So it's very pragmatic in that way, in that it's because we can directly affect it and it can directly affect us, it should be given supremacy. But the modern definition is giving major credence to like collections, and usually that means like wealth. Like we have Smog there, I think, or just any dragon.
Oh yes, the dragon, any dragon. Yeah,
I think that's Smog. That looks like the.
I think it's Smog.
Yeah. Or like, you know, just like having possessions, stuff like that. So modern materialism is that kind of thing, deriving pleasure from materials, which is not really the direct opposite of minimalism, which we talk about next, but there are definitely some stark contrasts between the two. But I think, yeah, go ahead.
Minimalism is kind of a response to societies that have become extremely materialistic. But minimalism doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get pleasure from your objects. It just means that you get more pleasure from having a small amount of things that you like, or the things that are necessary for you to survive and live happily, and you do not have any excess whatsoever. Materialism could be like wanting excess wealth and extravagance. It could also just be wanting things that are unnecessary, even though that make you happy. So they aren't, like Sebastian said, they aren't exactly opposites. I think minimalism is definitely a response to materialism, but yeah, they're kind of two sides of the same coin, not exactly opposites. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to say that the material world is what we interact with. So what will make me happier? A new understanding of life or a new fancy car that I really like to drive? Even generally, I would say as a society, we've been moving away from materialism, but you can sort of understand, I guess, the thought process there, that if something is going to make me happy, I want it. And again, materialism is often associated with like American culture and society, especially like, you know, I would say like 50s era, right? I lots of materialism, but yeah.
I think with American culture, it's a little interesting because we have more consolidated materialism. It's not the more materials we have, the better off we are. It's the more that one material can do for us, the better off we are. Because think of like America is stereotypically famous for having like really big food items, for example. Like our sizes, like getting a Trenta at Starbucks or getting like like the McDouble or like the McTriple. I don't even know if that's a thing, but you can't get that like anywhere else. Like maybe like some whack village in Germany, but it's just, I feel like that's pretty unique to American culture. And it's an interesting take on materialism, rather than it's like, you know, just how much can one thing do? Because like, think about it. We have like phones, like smartphones. It's one thing that can do like a billion things.
Yeah, it is interesting, and there is like a modicum of merit. I would say it's another sort of, I don't know, maybe I'm like being too like loose with the definition of hedonism, but I feel like a lot of these philosophies are based upon hedonism as a foundation. Materialism is saying material objects will increase the pleasure in my life, therefore I want them, right? I don't know if that's a fair interpretation, but that's kind of how I see it. It's like hedonists are often probably materialistic because the things that they buy would make them happier. would increase pleasure, and so they would want them. So
yeah. So yeah, like we said, the response to materialism is minimalism, with the dumbass IKEA cabinet.
Minimalism is extremely interesting to me as a movement because today, like, a lot of the so-called minimalist products have almost become their own sort of like high-end living style, and they're by no means cheap. Like, if you look up minimalist furniture, I think it will actually like cost you more than some things that might have been considered like materialistic years ago, like in the 50s, for example.
interesting.
It's interesting that humans look to eliminate waste by living in such a like fancy way, in my opinion. But it's really just about living in like a sleek, like wasteless type of existence, like being eco-friendly. I mean, technically being vegan is kind of minimalistic. We're seeing a lot more movements for minimalism as a response to the McTriple that America is putting out.
Yeah, it is interesting. Minimalism. I think it's a Thoreau quote that it's like, when you own the land owns you. And I think you could say that about possessions as well. And so as a minimalist, is that?
Yeah,
that
things
is.
you own end up owning you.
Too, isn't
That's Fight Club quote.
That is Fight Club. I thought it was.
Oh yeah.
I don't believe that such a good quote like that can come from simply Fight Club. I don't know.
Simply Fight Club. Simply Fight Club.
I mean, I guess that one.
You mean one of the best postmodernist films of this modern age?
Yeah.
Oh my Lord.
But what's that one quote from Spy Kids? I don't know. I guess anything's possible.
Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of his creations?
Yeah, Spy Kids. But anyway, it is sort of interesting as a minimalist to think that material possessions, unlike we have been led to believe, they don't actually bring you pleasure. They bring you unnecessary items that you need to tend to and care for and worry about. So having less and having things that are only functional, having things that actually provide a tangible benefit and make your life easier are important things to have. But then those that do not, it is best not to have them because they will actually weigh you down and sort of make your life harder. And also, it's like, it's kind of related to Stoicism a little bit, in that it's like you have to sort of achieve like an inner understanding of yourself and of the world, and like an inner sort of peace versus being satisfied with the objects around you. For a minimalist, it could be that having fewer objects around you actually makes you less distracted and clears your mind more, so that you are able to find that higher understanding of the world, that sort of enlightenment. So I think it's an interesting philosophy.
Yeah. Again.
And I will be severely disappointed if that quote is from Fight Club and I misattributed it to Thoreau. Oh my God, I would feel like an idiot. But
the things you own end up owning you. I'm seeing Fight Club. Okay, well, Fight Club was also a book. You have to remember Fight Club was a book, and it's a pretty well-regarded book.
No, I'm not trying to disparage Fight Club.
Yeah, no.
I like Fight Club, but I just feel like...
Okay, what did Thoreau say about possessions?
Thoreau said that we don't own things.
Okay, Thoreau... So the quote from Thoreau is, "Our houses are such unwieldy property that we are often imprisoned rather than housed in them," which is along the same lines.
All right.
But yeah, so I would say at least the idea began or was popularized by Thoreau. So
Whoa. In this quote, it says Thoreau built his own home for $28 and 12 1/2 cents.
Chad.
I mean, that's not supposed to be taken as an average for the time, but like, oh my God, because he's already being like fairly minimalist here. It's like, geez, to build a house for 28 1/2
Wait, what's
like
that
dollars.
adjusted for inflation?
I don't know. That's probably. I have no idea.
Let's see.
Dude,
He's like-
today that wouldn't even buy you like a tent, like a good tent. I don't think. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, but yeah,
it's about $1,000 today. Still though, like that's cheap house.
yeah.
Very.
But yeah, Thoreau, smart guy. But minimalism, again, I think it's useful in some aspects, and this is one of the ones that you can subscribe to pretty fully. Getting to 100% minimalism is especially in like America, it's very hard. Not impossible.
Because it's also like there are conflicting definitions of what minimalism
Absolutely.
is. Right.
Yeah. But
So
we can pop over to the next one.
But it is definitely possible to achieve 100% of your own definition of it.
Yeah.
If it's just like, don't own anything that isn't like practically useful,
Yeah.
then you could probably achieve that. But if it's like, don't own anything, become Diogenes, own a barrel and a bowl.
A barrel and a bowl.
Like that's all he owned. He owned a barrel and a bowl to eat food out of. Like, that's probably very difficult to achieve.
Yeah. But then we go over to intellectualism.
I like this picture on the right.
Yes, this is the most
Oh my
well-respected
God.
proof of the power rule of all time. Everyone, oh my, like the fact, it's so genius, isn't it, that they crossed out the D in the derivative sign, and then they used
Yes.
the remaining line as the negative, and then the X somehow multiplies over. Oh my, it just makes so much sense. It's actually funny
Brilliant.
to me, though, that they prove, like, I don't know if you've seen in calc textbooks when they have the chain rule,
Mhm.
and they do that BS proof where, like, the DU cancels out, even though that's not, like, it's...
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there is definitely an abuse of the notation in calculus.
Mhm.
The problem is I do not understand it without the abuse of notation. So
Yeah.
that's the difficulty. But yeah, intellectualism. So this is about valuing the pursuit of knowledge and
Yeah.
obtaining knowledge.
Just so yeah, it definitely falls under the logic branch, because it's very well associated with reason.
It could also be axiology to a certain extent, because it's saying that like the purpose in life
Yes.
is to pursue knowledge. The purpose in life is to figure out the truth, to figure out the whole of the universe and how it works, like to develop the the greatest possible understanding of it. And in that, I think it's very interesting.
I've heard some people argue that our society is becoming more anti-intellectualist by supporting like equality too much. I personally don't see like the conflict between the two, and I don't think that giving everyone equal education or opportunity is an attempt to
exactly
decrease
that would probably
intellectual.
That would probably increase intellectualism, if more people were learning things. But there definitely have been anti-intellectual movements throughout history. Basically, look at any movement that has decided to burn books. There you go. That is anti-intellectual. And a lot of movements have sort of like, they would target like college professors and stuff like that. There's definitely groups that are anti-intellectual, but yeah, intellectualism, I think it generally does well. I think it's a generally good idea.
Prioritizing the use of one's intellect. Absolutely. I feel like a lot of philosophies could be said to be intellectual, under the purview of intellectualism.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how cynics would respond to this though, if they would just be like, we assume the average person is dumb, or what would their argument against this even be?
I feel like Diogenes would definitely be like, the average person is an idiot, and I am too.
Yeah. So the cynical argument would probably be the average person is an idiot, and supposed intellectuals are actually just charlatans that are just trying to influence people and trying to get their own personal benefit by
that would probably be
your mic cut out there. I saw that you swapped your earbuds. Sorry about that.
The battery's running low.
There you go. You're back.
Basically what I was saying is that the cynical belief is probably that the average person is dumb, and then those who claim to be intellectual are actually charlatans, and that they are diluting people for their own self-benefit. Like a snake oil salesman, right? Saying oh, look, all the science says that this snake oil will cure you of every disease on the planet. You should totally buy it. And the real motive there is to sell the snake oil, not to actually teach people, right? That would be the cynical argument, I would guess.
Yeah.
All right,
then we pop over to utilitarianism.
Yeah. So utilitarianism is interesting. It's brought up a lot in respect to the trolley problem. And to a certain extent, I think everyone has a certain extent of utilitarianism in them, but probably the vast majority of people don't go to the extreme of utilitarianism. So utilitarianism says that the moral choice is the choice that maximizes happiness across humanity. So if your choice requires, or the basic maximum happiness or pleasure or whatever, it's basically maximizing goodness throughout all of humanity. And the problem with that is that utilitarianism can say, if you have to do something that negatively affects one person in order to benefit the whole, then you should do it. And in some instances, that can lead to some pretty what would you say, disturbing ramifications. So the trolley problem, I would say most people think that it is justified to flip the switch. Basically, if you don't know the trolley problem, it's that you've got a runaway train is about to run into 5 people, but you can flip a switch and the train will run down a different track where it will run into 1 person. There is no way to alert the people or get them off the track. All you can do is choose to flip the switch or not. Most people choose to flip the switch in that thought experiment because they say it's better that only 1 person dies instead of 5 people die. Mm-hmm. Now, what about this situation? There are 5 patients in a hospital. Each of them has a failure of one major organ. So one person needs kidneys, one person needs a liver, right? One person needs a heart, one person needs new lungs, right? You've got 5 different people that need organ transplants. And now you have one perfectly healthy person that's just happens to be nearby the hospital. Is it moral to just harvest that person's organs to save the lives of the other 5 people? I would say almost everyone
While
would
you
say,
think about that, we have some chat on that happy
all
note.
right.
Ponder on that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But all right, so the chat says, let's see. All right, Pluto says Ted Kaczynski.
Ted Kaczynski.
All right. And then Thomas Sargent says, did I miss utilitarianism? This makes me cry. Extreme util gang.
He came in just on utilitarianism.
Just
Did I not say this, Tom, as we were creating this episode? I was like, it was Zach, right? You said you used the term util, and I'm like,
Yeah.
Util.
you've been hanging out with Sargent too much. He's the only person that says util because he's so into it. So I'm so glad that you are here with us, Thomas
Yeah.
Sargent.
How do you
Yeah.
feel to be the predecessor to communism? Like,
Yeah.
is it nice? Is it enjoyable?
Wait, really?
I mean,
Interesting. I don't know the history.
no,
Um,
it's not really the predecessor.
Okay.
It's just some people like
but
to joke that it
okay. But yeah, to go back to the thought experiment, right?
Mm.
Complete utilitarianism would say, yes, you should kill the healthy person, harvest their organs in order to save the lives of the other 5 people. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, no, that is morally wrong, and you should not do that. But yeah, it is like there are difficult situations that are maybe somewhere in the middle where it's like, basically, I would say that the thesis of utilitarianism is the ends justify the means.
Mm-hmm.
And typically that is something we disagree with in society. Like generally people would agree with utilitarianism as long as it doesn't require them to do anything that they believe to be morally reprehensible, right? So again, with the trolley problem, it's like, oh, you're just flipping a switch. There's not much difference between one set of people on a track and the other set of people on the track. All I'm trying to do is minimize harm. But then the organs example, it's so visceral and it goes against the principle of like the Hippocratic Oath,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just like the principles of like, consent in medicine and like self-autonomy. It goes against so many other of our moral standards that perhaps it is better to allow those 5 people to die rather than to violate those sort of principles that we hold so dear. So
Yeah, definitely. Everyone is utilitarian to some degree.
yeah,
It varies, but it's definitely a very interesting thought experiment because it has merit. Even when you take it to its absolute extremes, like the organ example.
mm-hmm.
If you took a different philosophy to its like logical extreme, I feel like
It
utilitarianism
get similar.
Yeah, but I feel like that even that organ example has a little bit more has more merit than some of the extremes of other philosophies.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Because again, like to increase to use happiness as the weighing mechanism definitely has flaws, but because you can, by extension, if happiness is increased, that means that other things must also be getting like better. As long as that happiness is able to be sustained, then it's a sustainable model. It's a
mm-hmm.
valid philosophy, I would say.
Yeah. I would say
yeah.
the problem would probably be that it ignores the sort of intangible effects, like the mental effects.
Yeah.
In that having to live in a society where you could randomly be called upon to sacrifice yourself and your organs compulsory for the sake of other people, living in a society like that would probably induce a state of fear and dread in people, and would actually, I think, would lead to more casualties just from stress alone. It would cause heart attacks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it is, I would say, probably if you were to really like truly be utilitarian and look at that scenario, you would actually say, let the 5 people die. The problem might be simplistic utilitarianism rather than utilitarianism itself, right? The problem with most utilitarians might be that they are looking at the situation too simply. And if they were to actually look at it on the whole, they might realize that to do things that are sort of counterintuitive would actually increase the happiness or the net good in a society. And so that is an interesting way to look at utilitarianism, to sort of expand upon the simplistic definition.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think we have another example of a philosophy influenced heavily by hedonism in utilitarianism. And we have this quote from Jeremy Bentham, maybe Bentham, I don't know.
Bentham, I think.
Bentham?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. He said that humans are ruled by two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain, which definitely harkens back to hedonism.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And he said that they govern us in all we do and all we say and in all we think. So I think utilitarianism is really just a response to hedonism in trying to get not just the individual pleasures satisfied, but the most pleasures possible for a group of people.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We have some more chat from Thomas Sargent.
Chat says. Yes, Thomas Sargent says, the utilitarian would say that harvesting that person's organs would lead to a negative externality of less people going to the doctor. Yeah. You're catching on, Seb. Any utilitarian worth their salt would consider such externality.
I don't know if I can subscribe to utilitarianism, Tom. And I am making a poster that says Thomas Sargent wants to harvest your organs. You'll see it soon. But
it is interesting because I think you could maybe make an argument through utilitarianism that human rights improve society, even if in individual circumstances to disrespect someone's human rights might improve the whole for that one situation. I would say that on the whole, society is actually better if you respect individual human rights.
It's interesting because it's absolutely comparable to hedonism. It's just I feel like it's more like communal hedonism because it's like net total of pleasure versus just like the pleasure of an individual. So this is again very similar to humanism because it's one of the ones that requires a community to be able to be fully realized. And it's no surprise that it's a little more recent in the grand scheme of things. Like Bentham, 1789. From what I know, it was like around Industrial Revolution, so late 18th century, early 19th century, right? Yeah. I hate that. But
I hate that system. It has to stop. It must be stopped.
All of that.
It's gonna say 1700s.
Yeah. It's no surprise that it's a more recent one, and especially around the Industrial Revolution, when that was kind of a time of a lot of suffering, but also of great pleasure because now people are like, hey, I can spin this cotton with just 2 pedals and a wheel and all that. I don't need to be working at it for extensive periods of time. So yeah, no doubt that philosophers like Bentham saw those as the 2 governing factors. But I think that's utilitarianism.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting because, again, sort of like how hedonism has that negative stereotype, utilitarianism definitely has that negative stereotype of the cold, dispassionate leader who's like, yes, sacrifice them for the good of the whole. And it's like, maybe there's a new way to look at it. And again, I think that you could justify a very heavy focus on human rights through utilitarianism. That says that sacrificing people, forcing people to be sacrificed for the sake of the whole, actually negatively impacts society.
The Aztecs were utilitarian. They were like, listen, man, Quetzalcoatl is going to nuke us all if we don't cut your heart out.
Yeah.
We need you to get on that pedestal like yesterday.
Yep.
He's like, and if the old Aztecs
something
are
interesting.
like, well, there you go, for the good of the people.
Something interesting is that our bodies behave in a utilitarian way, like the cells of our body. I mean, think of apoptosis, right?
Yes, when you get a sunburn.
Our bodies are like the perfect utilitarian model. It's that the cells of our body will sacrifice themselves for the good of the whole. And that is apoptosis is cell suicide, when a cell notices that it is damaged, its DNA sequence, and that it could become cancerous. Oftentimes, the cell will decide to actually kill itself for the benefit of the entire body. And that is how all multicellular organisms function. It's because the cells all willingly engage in a way that benefits the whole rather than themselves. And I mean, I say willingly, but again, these are not conscious entities. These are cells. They're tiny automata that are operating according to a long string of programming called our DNA. But still, it is sort of interesting to look at it like that. And I would say probably many animals, like hive animals, probably act in a utilitarian way.
Absolutely.
Like insects and stuff like that. Like for the good of the hive. And so it is interesting, the value of utilitarianism. But
yeah,
again, I would say the problem is that sometimes it can be used to justify atrocities, would probably be my main criticism there.
Yeah, I think that is util.
Should we move on to the ultimate philosophy?
Yes.
Yeah,
Gym
the ultimate
class.
philosophy.
Explain
Gym
this.
class.
Yeah. Explain this.
Okay. This is perhaps the most well-crafted gym curriculum in all of history. It succeeded to do what the human race has failed to do in the last few centuries, which is to unite seemingly opposed schools of thought, all for the purpose of developing the best gym curriculum ever.
Mm.
So we've got these objectives of this one gym curriculum. I feel like they use it in Canada. Not sure. It gives me real Canadian vibes. But here we go. Idealism, right? Gym class develops personality and the mind. Each individual's ability to come up with their own set of ideal characteristics and develop their ideal personality. Right? We got realism. Gym class prepares you to meet the realities of life, because everyone knows that at your first job interview, you will be asked to perform the PACER test. Naturalism. Developing the whole person. I mean, you got to be able to lift if you're going to go live in nature. Pragmatism. Helping students to become better functioning members of society. Indeed, I can 100% say that my gym class experience has helped me. I feel like we're missing self-efficacy here. Shout out to CJ Shalmas on that one. But last but not least, we've got existentialism, assisting students to become self-actualizing, independent beings. Yes. Learning to play badminton, definitely did that.
Well, you could say, I wonder if you could do the team sports give you utilitarianism.
Ooh.
Yes.
Right? You could say, help students learn to contribute to the whole of the team, right? And like, I don't know, what are things where you might sacrifice yourself in a sport for the sake of the team? I don't know, say an assist, right? It's like, instead of trying to get the goal for yourself, saying, oh, your teammates can get the goal. Gym class, the ultimate philosophy.
Yeah, this is the gym class that Plato attended, all that stuff. And yeah, this is
all right.
This is the checklist, the agenda for success.
Yes.
But anyways.
Exactly. All right, we've got a bit more chat. Thomas Sargent says, I GTG pick up a bar taco order, but I need to learn more about this gym class philosophy. Then Pluto says, yeah, I've never felt more mentally stimulated than when I'm playing hacky sack with Mr. Shamus.
Yes, that is naturalism. Develop your person
Naturalism.
through hacky sack. But, anyways, final thoughts.
Yeah. All right. Final thoughts. So that was a lot of different philosophies. I love philosophy. It's just fun. It's just fun to consider these individual questions. I could talk about the ship of Theseus forever, as it relates to like the mind uploading problem. It's so interesting, and just our conception of the self, even just ignoring any sort of just futuristic thing, just right now. Such an important issue to ponder. But then, yes, then also the trolley problem, to think about to what extent does utilitarianism extend in the human mind? How much should we value utilitarianism? How much do we value it? All of these different questions I find so interesting, and they really interact with like who we are as people, you know, as humanity, and it's great. So yeah, that was fun. Do you guys have anything to say?
Yeah, I mean,
Close this out.
philosophy, it's the mark of sentience. It really is. When you can start thinking about how to like conduct your life and, you know, just ethics and empathy and all of that kind of stuff, humans have realized that more than the majority of life on Earth. Like elephants have empathy, but elephants are clearly superior to us. I wonder what elephant philosophy is like.
Elephant philosophy.
I bet they are hardcore utilitarians. But anyways, yeah, I think it's the mark of a truly advanced society. And you think about like the birthplace of philosophy, ancient Greece, often pointed to as one of the most prosperous times in human history. It's no coincidence that as human prosperity increases, philosophy increases, because it's people trying to figure out how to live life, trying to make sense out of things, which is why nihilism is fucking dumb. That there's our F-bomb for the stream.
Damn.
There you
He
go.
said it.
I said it. It's dumb.
You got the one.
I got the one. This is now, if we get any more, it'll become immediately R-rated. But
Exactly. Now here's the best part. If any nihilists try to refute you, you can just say like, "Oh, so you do care about."
so you do care, huh? You know, right there. But
It's
Zach,
hard to have an opinion as a nihilist.
yeah.
They're like, would you like cheese with that? No. Sorry.
I don't know. It doesn't matter. What is the meaning and value of cheese?
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right, Zach. Any final thoughts?
Yeah.
I think Descartes was a little bit off, right?
Mm-hmm.
He said, "I think, therefore I am."
Mm-hmm.
I really think it should be, "I am a philosopher, therefore I am." I think everyone that can think about these topics, I think everyone actually does think about philosophy. That, like you guys said, is really what being conscious is all about. And my favorite thing is just comparing all of the different schools of thought to each other, because it's like so many different takes on the fundamental questions, but they all sort of play off each other in a way. Whether it's opposing each other or borrowing from one another, it seems to suggest that like the answers to the questions do exist, regardless of how convoluted they might be. It just makes me feel very hopeful. You know?
Yeah.
So thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being our guest this week. You are definitely very knowledgeable about philosophy. And yeah, that was a very fun episode. So thanks, Zach. And thank you, everyone who watched this and made use of the chat. We love talking to you guys in the chat. And thank you, Sebastian, for being my co-host as always.
As always.
And with that, I guess we are done for the day. So yeah, this afternoon, this evening, take some more time to ponder some philosophical questions and Yeah, we'll see you all next week. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye bye.